Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Explainer. Okay, we're jumping right into things today. We are going on a full-blown historical detective masterclass. Think about it. We're traveling way back, roughly to the period between 600 BCE and 600 CE, and we're going to try to crack the codes of ancient Indian society. How did people live? Who did they love? How did they organize power? Grab your magnifying glasses, because we're about to think like historians and figure out the whole system of kinship, caste, and class.
So just imagine for a second waking up 2,000 years ago. What if I told you that your family, your caste, and your marriage literally decided your entire future? There's no, oh, I think I want to be a trader when I grow up, or marrying whoever you fall in love with. Nope. You couldn't even own property just because you worked hard for it. Your wealth, your job, your social standing, the whole shebang was strictly dictated by the group you were born into. It was a world of incredibly rigid rules. But how do we actually know all of this?
Well, we know it because of this massive, mind-boggling number, 100,000. That's the number of verses in the Mahabharata. And here's the kicker, right? The Mahabharata isn't just a religious epic or a dramatic story about two warring sets of cousins. For historians, it is literally a colossal 100,000-verse-long database. It is absolutely packed with the social rules, the messy politics, and the moral codes of early Indian society.
But as you can imagine, reading and making sense of a text that huge wasn't exactly a walk in the park. Which brings us to our next big number, 47. It actually took 47 years for an incredibly brilliant Sanskrit scholar named V.S. Sukthankar and his team to solve this massive historical puzzle. They started way back in 1919, gathering over 1,000 different manuscripts of the epic from all over, from Kashmir all the way down to Kerala. And then, they painstakingly compared every single verse to find the common elements, filtering out all the local variations, and eventually created a monumental 13,000-page document known as the Critical Edition.
Okay, let's do a quick knowledge check. What was the actual primary purpose of this massive 47-year project to create a critical edition? Think about it for a second. The goal was to basically eliminate all those later regional editions and preserve the original, authentic material. This gave scholars a reliable, rock-solid baseline so they could accurately study the ancient social teachings and see how society actually functioned.
All right, so now that we have our ultimate source material, let's look at the actual rules of the society it describes. We'll start with kinship and family. You've probably heard the term Gotra. It's a patrilineal clan, which just means descent is traced through the father. You can think of it like a very strict, ancient version of a family surname. According to Brahmanical rules from around 1000 BCE, people of the same Gotra were descendants of the same ancient Vedic seer, which meant they absolutely, under no circumstances, could marry each other. And for the women, well, they had to completely give up their father's Gotra and adopt their husbands the moment they got married.
Which leads us perfectly into the two big E's of ancient marriage rules. These are absolutely crucial if you want to understand how power was built back then. First, exogamy. This was the strict Brahmanical rule: you must marry outside your kin group or gotra. Then you have endogamy, which is the exact opposite. That means marrying inside your specific unit, kin, caste, or even locality. Now, the official texts, the Dharmashastras, they pushed really hard for exogamy because it helped build broader alliances and, prevented incest.
But, and there's always a but in history, right? Real life was a lot messier. The texts actually recognized 8 different forms of marriage, though they straight up condemned 4 of them. Here's a fun historical detective question for you. Do you think the kings always followed these strict Brahmanical rules? Nope, not a chance. Just look at the powerful Satavahana rulers of the Deccan. They completely flipped the script. A lot of the Satavahana kings proudly kept their mothers' names, which we call metronomics, like Gautamiputra Satakarni, and their queens. Many of them kept their father's Gotra after marriage and practiced endogamy, marrying right within their own kin network.
Let's see if you were paying attention. When we talk about marriage within a unit, a kin group, a caste, or a specific locality, what is that called? Right, that's endogamy. This practice of keeping power, alliances, and resources tightly localized was actually a major feature of certain regions, and it directly defied those broad, exogamous rules written by the elites in the central texts. Definitely keep that in mind.
Okay, let's zoom out a bit and see how this all builds into the broader society. The Dharma Sutras laid down a very theoretical, fourfold hierarchy known as the Varna system. You had Brahmanas at the top, studying the Vedas, then the Kshatriyas, who were meant to rule and fight. Below them, the Vaishyas handling agriculture and trade, and finally the Shudras, who were expected to serve the other 3. The text tried to claim this was a divine, completely natural, and unshakable order.
But here is a super important historical distinction you need to make: Varna versus Jati.
What's the actual difference? Well, Varna was this fixed theoretical framework of just those 4 categories. But as society got more complex, what do you do with forest dwellers like the Nishidas, or specialized workers like a guild of silk weavers? They didn't really fit. So the text created jatis. Jatis were practical. They were based on specific occupations. And unlike the 4 rigid Varnas, there was absolutely no restriction on the number of jatis. They were basically infinite.
Now let's talk about my favorite part, the rule breakers. The official texts swore up and down that only Kshatriyas could rule, but history shows us a completely different story. The mighty Mauryan Empire, later Brahmanical texts hint they were actually of low origin. The Shungas and Kanvas who came after them, they were Brahmanas, not Kshatriyas. Meanwhile, you had jatis of craftspeople organizing themselves into these incredibly powerful guilds called Shrenis. And some marginalized groups, who were labeled as Chandalas or untouchables, didn't always just silently accept their degraded status. Society was way more fluid than the strict rulebooks would have you believe.
In fact, if we look outside the Brahmanical texts, we find completely different perspectives on society. Take a Buddhist text like the Matanga Jataka. It offered a deeply sympathetic view of those who were cast out by society. While the Manusmriti prescribed a life of extreme degradation for Chandalas, literally forcing them to live outside the village and wear the clothes of the dead, these Buddhist texts showed that human dignity, morality, and true wisdom weren't restricted by birth at all.
So, quick checkpoint. According to the Shastras, only which Varna was supposed to rule the country? Yep, the Kshatriyas. But as we just saw with rebels like the Mauryas and the Shungas, political power wasn't just limited by birth. If you had the resources and the support, you could rule. Real-world power often dictated a person's status, forcing the texts to adapt to reality, rather than reality adapting to the texts.
Speaking of resources, let's shift our focus to wealth. Let's look beyond just birth and see how money and property actually defined your status. Access to wealth was heavily restricted. Take the term stridana, which literally translates to a woman's wealth. According to the texts, women could not inherit their father's land. The only wealth they could truly call their own were the gifts they received during their wedding. They could pass this stridana on to their children, and legally their husbands couldn't claim it.
So, who actually controlled the big resources? Unsurprisingly, men generally controlled the land, the cattle, and the money. I mean, just imagine having absolutely zero legal right to your family's core property simply because of your gender. Now, there were rare exceptions, like the Vakataka queen Prabhavati Gupta, who famously managed land, but she was royalty, so she was playing by a different set of rules. Varna also dictated wealth. The texts obviously aimed to keep Brahmanas and Kshatriyas at the top, but in reality, we actually have historical records of incredibly wealthy Shudra merchants and desperately poor Brahmanas.
So, we have to ask the bigger so what question here. How did this gendered access to property actually affect social status? The crucial takeaway is this. By keeping land and major resources almost exclusively in the hands of men, these ancient societies deeply, fundamentally reinforced patriarchal power structures. Economic dependence basically guaranteed social subordination for women. It was a structural inequality that was completely baked into the system.
But as always in history, there was an alternative voice. Early Buddhism provided a really sharp critique of this rigid Varna order. They argue that, yeah, sure, society has differences, but these inequalities are entirely artificial and temporary. They completely rejected the idea that someone is inherently superior just because they happen to be born into a specific family or caste.
The Buddhists even had a totally different, kind of mind-blowing theory for how kings came to power in the first place. Instead of kings being appointed by the gods, Buddhist texts like the Sutta Pitaka introduced the concept of Mahasamata, which means the great elect. The idea was that humans intentionally chose a leader to maintain order and protect them, and in return for doing his job, they paid him a portion of their rice as taxes. This is a massive deal. This Buddhist concept of Mahasamatata is revolutionary because it represents a very early example of, what? A social contract. It was a system based on human choice and mutual agreement rather than some unquestionable divine right. It showed that society could be organized around utility, consent, and fairness.
We've covered a ton of ground here, extracting all this real-world history from these ancient accounts. But it is vital to remember that texts like the Mahabharata weren't just written over a long weekend. They evolved over a staggering 1,000 years, from roughly 500 BCE to 500 CE. Generations were constantly adding new authors, new stories, and new social rules. And that's exactly why Sukhthunker's 20th Century Critical Edition project was so vital. It allowed us to peel back those layers of 1,000 years of history to see what was really going on. Okay, let's bring it all together. To wrap up our historical detective work, here are the absolute core pillars we've uncovered today. The massive effort behind the critical edition of the Mahabharata, the complex marriage rules of Gotra and exogamy versus endogamy, the theoretical Varna versus the highly practical Jati, the harsh reality of wealth distribution beyond just your birth, and finally, the revolutionary Buddhist theory of the social contract.
I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought as we wrap up this explainer. Knowing everything we just discussed about rigid castes, strict marriage rules, and heavily gendered property rights, would you have quietly accepted these rules if you lived 2,000 years ago? Or would you have been one of the rebels? Think about how much society has evolved since then, and yet how some of these echoes definitely still remain today. Thank you so much for joining me in this historical detective masterclass. Stay curious, keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.